It was a week ago. I guess I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to have lived most of his life in Oregon and in Idaho. And he said to me one morning, said, "What's with all of these stagnant air alerts that we're having in the weather forecast?" He said, "This is highly unusual." We went a period of a couple of weeks where the wind barely blew across the Northwest, which is highly unusual. And our next guest actually had been writing about this. He's with the Washington Policy Center in the state of Washington. His name is Todd Myers. He's the director of the Center for the Environment at the Policy Center. And I saw a piece that he had posted last week about this. And it mentioned, of course, the obvious: when the wind isn't blowing, wind turbines aren't going to be generating a whole heck of a lot of power. On the other hand, you have people who think we should dismantle the hydropower systems along the rivers in the Northwest, and perhaps that might not be wise because, yes, indeed, there are times. Well, actually, that's a lot more reliable. The water continues to flow. Just a quick note: we're at 31 at 6 minutes after 8 o'clock. Bill Cowley on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. And Mr. Myers, or Dr. Myers, I don't know what title it is. I didn't bother to ask you, but welcome to the program.
Mr. Myers is fine, or Todd, but thank you very much for having me.
All right, super. I just wanted to begin with you wrote the piece, and I was tickled to see it because I was telling you off air I've had some conversations with some of the legislative leadership here in Idaho, and some of them feel when we started putting in the wind power systems 15, 20 years ago that it likely was a mistake. This is obvious, I think, to most people when they drive by and they don't see these things spinning around. And yet we have, in fact, our own representative, U.S. representative in this bailiwick, he's actually talking about getting on board with pulling out some of these dams. I take it you don't believe that's a good idea?
Well, I think in terms of the energy situation, what makes the wind power possible in the Pacific Northwest is the existence of the dams. Wind in the Northwest, and especially Washington State, blows primarily in the middle of the night. So occasionally people will say to me, well, I see the wind turbines turning during the day sometimes, and that's true. Occasionally that happens. But if you look at the Bonneville Power grid system, grid management, the wind blows primarily in the middle of the night. Middle of the night is when we have the lowest demand. People are asleep, businesses are shut down. And so it's sort of the least valuable power that you can put on the grid. What makes up the difference is, at least in the Northwest, is hydro. So at 6 and 7 p.m., when we have the largest demand of the day, when people are coming home and their business is still open, basically all of that is either hydro or natural gas, and then some nuclear in the Northwest. It's not the wind. And so without the hydro power, the wind simply wouldn't be possible unless you replaced it with natural gas, which a lot of people don't want to do.
And I'm guessing, too, living in Washington State, you've got some major metropolitan areas that without that power source from hydroelectric, people would simply be living. We think it's bad in California right now. I'm going to guess it would be far worse.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of points about that. The first is that the city of Seattle, which calls itself the nation's greenest utility, has only 1% of its energy supplied by wind. More than 90% is supplied by hydro. So the city of Seattle likes to point its finger and lecture others about being green, but they're not buying any wind power. They're buying a very tiny percentage of wind power, and they want the rest of us to buy it. The second thing is that what's happening in California as a result of transmission lines that go down and spark fires. One of the challenges with wind is that where the wind blows isn't necessarily where the transmission lines are. You can site a gas plant anywhere you want close to transmission. You can't do that with wind. And so what you end up doing, one of the high costs of wind is that you have to build all those transmission lines. And I think obviously the temperatures and the situation in the Pacific Northwest is a little different than California, but the problem that started those fires, it gets magnified if you have to string power lines all over the place for wind.
And I don't think solar is obviously an answer, and especially in the good portion of the Northwest. If I recall, Seattle is usually considered either number one or two every year on that list of most overcast cities in the country.
Yeah, so the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which looks at wind and solar and other renewables, has a map where they show the best and worst places to put solar power. Western Washington, Seattle, is ranked the worst in the lower 48 of the entire country. So, yeah, it's not very good here. Southern Idaho actually is okay. It's still not nearly as good as places like Arizona and Phoenix, but solar is a very tiny percentage of our electricity, and it's not going to make up a big difference in terms of production. In Washington State, all of rooftop solar, all of industrial solar accounts for 0.08% of our electricity, basically nothing. In Idaho, I didn't look up the numbers for Idaho, but I can tell you it's not much more. So even if we think that there's opportunity in southern Idaho or elsewhere, there's a long way to go. And I'll just add, California, of course, is probably done the most in terms of building out solar for energy generation. But again, at peak hours in 6 to 7 p.m., the sun is going down and demand is going up. And so, California, people will talk about, that there are certain times of day where California is 100% renewable. But at the peak demand, California is about 10% renewable, and the rest of it is either nuclear or a lot of fossil fuels. So that's the part that they don't like to tell you about solar.
Does it? The question I've always had for the environmentalists: do they not see the contradiction in what they're saying? Because they would simply not only leave a lot of people in the dark, but so many people in this day and age, for health reasons, they depend on having that current come into the house, whether it be for just something as simple as a CPAP machine. But some heart patients obviously need even more of this. That they would completely shut down a good part of the economy, and there would be, I don't know, starvation and theft and anarchy. They don't ever seem to see a contradiction in their position.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of reasons that I think that they don't see the problems. First is that I just think that they just have faith that they're right, and so people don't like to hear contradictory arguments, especially when they believe they're saving the planet. So I think that faith sort of allows them to wave off a lot of concerns. But the irony is that if you're talking about climate change, one of the biggest areas we need to address CO2 emissions is in transportation. And so the environmental community wants us to move away from gas-powered cars to electric vehicles, which is fine. Electric vehicles are cool. They're a little expensive, but they're kind of fun. But they draw a ton of electricity. And so if you're talking about moving from gasoline to electricity, our electrical demands are not going to go down. They're going to go up. And so what you need is reliable sources of energy to meet that rapidly growing demand. And if you're talking about tearing down dams and going in the other direction and replacing dams likely with natural gas and other things like that, which emit more CO2, you're moving in the wrong direction, not just in terms of available energy to charge vehicles, but also in the makeup of that energy. So we just don't, if we're going to go the direction the environmentalists want, and I think it's fine, I'm a fan of new technology and electric cars, but if we're going to do that, tearing down dams and eliminating power that can be turned on and off when the wind isn't there is just really foolish and counterproductive.
Just want to mention that we're coming up on 8:14. It's 35, and we're speaking with Todd Myers. He's with Washington Policy Center and the director of their Center for the Environment. And you're listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. And 33 at the moment, on our way probably into the mid to upper 40s before the day is over. When we talk about the lack of wind that was somewhat of an anomaly, I guess. But some years ago, I remember reading a story, probably half a dozen years ago, and it said that they were doing wind measurements in the Midwest, probably Nebraska, Oklahoma area, and wind speeds I read this, in fact, I think in the Washington Times, wind speeds had been slowing down ever since, they're so, the figure is not, dramatic, because you don't notice it over 45 years, but they've been slowing down since the early 1970s. If that's the case, and it's a prolonged part of all of this, then wind power really becomes even less attractive.
I think there's another challenge as well, which is that the wind turbines that have been put up in the best spots. So, typically when we think about solar or other new technologies, we think about the cost coming down over time as the technology improves. And the technology of wind turbines is improving, but the locations that you can put them in are not necessarily improving. And in fact, what you may be seeing is that wind turbines are now being placed in spots that are less optimal than the ones they're in already. In the last quarter, actually, we saw the cost of energy from wind turbines go up. And I think there's a variety of reasons for that, but over time, you're going to take the best spots, and the spots that you're going to have left behind are ones where the wind doesn't always blow, where the wind is not as strong, other things like that, and the capacity for wind generation is lower. So, all of those things make this very complex, and we can deal with those problems to some extent, but you can only deal with them if you have electricity that you can turn on and off, either in the forms of natural gas or hydro or other things like that.
Some years ago, too, I remember seeing, I think his name is Michio Kaku. He's the TV scientist. I call him the TV scientist. He seems to be everywhere. He was on a program, probably on the old learning channel, TLC, and I remember hearing him say that in the future, we're going to have to use, because of energy demands, everything that's available to us. And I don't know how well that would sell with environmentalists, but his view is that for the time being, until some of these other technologies improve, we've got to use everything we have just for the benefit of humanity.
Well, I think that's right, and I think there are new options. Like I said, if you're going to electrify the transportation system, that's a tremendous amount of new demand, electrical demand that is going to be put on the grid. And taking steps backwards, it really makes no sense. We need to be adding to our capacity, not reducing it, and we also need to be adding capacity that can be managed rather than intermittent, which we can't manage. So I think that's really correct. There's another new source of energy that is going to take a little bit of a while, but it's also occurring in Idaho, in eastern Idaho, which is a company called Nucor. NuScale. Nucor is another company, but NuScale, and they are building modular nuclear reactors out near the National Lab. And I met with the Department of Energy earlier this year and said, tell me about this. And they said, well, it's not even going to be permitted until 2024. So it's going to take a very long time just to get up and running to see what the possibility of modular nuclear is. But that's another new technology that we shouldn't forget about, that is more safe than existing nuclear. Existing nuclear is extremely safe, but it's even sort of the next level of technology. And it's also can be turned on and off in a way that existing nuclear really can't be ramped up and down immediately. So there's lots of new things. I think we fixate on wind and solar, but there are other things out there that I think have more potential, and modular nuclear is one of those.
Yeah, I think that the plan is to light up a lot of the Great Basin in Utah with that project, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Like I said, I just wish it wouldn't take so long to get permitted. I wish we could do some more experiments and find out what works so that we can bring these things online more rapidly. But that's the way these things are.
We've got to get to a break in about a minute or so, and then we have about 6 or 7 minutes afterwards to wrap up. But before we do, I had posted a link to what you wrote last week online. If people would like to see more of what you're writing about, where would you send them?
So our webpage is washingtonpolicy.org. We focus primarily on Washington State, but a lot of the policies and issues we address in Washington State get exported elsewhere, so you can see hopefully what's not coming to Idaho. In many of the cases, we have a lot of policies that I think are in the wrong direction. Or you can follow me on Twitter at WA Policy Green.
We've got more coming up with Todd Myers, Director of the Center for the Environment at Washington Policy Center, talking about some of these energy issues. But first, a break. It's 8:20. It's 33. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. We have a few more minutes left with Todd Myers from the Washington Policy Center joining us this morning, and we're talking about energy issues. It's coming up on 8:22. We're at 34. Bill Colley on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and NewsRadio1310.com. Thank you for joining us today. And Mr. Myers, when I posted that story last week to Facebook after I saw that you mentioned this, and I thought, I've got to get this one posted because I want to get some reaction to it right away. Most people that were reading it were quite favorable in their comments, but one person explained that he was a fisherman and said there's got to be a way to to at least get around this issue because he believes that the dams and other various projects, the hydropower projects, are harming our fish stocks. Uh, how do you respond to him?
So I actually sit on the Puget Sound Salmon Recovery Council. So part of my work all the time is salmon recovery, and I'm very sympathetic to that. My wife grew up actually on the Snake River, and my brother-in-law was married on the banks of the Clearwater. So, the Idaho rivers are very important to me. But tearing down the Snake River dams, NOAA Fisheries says it would do a very little to increase salmon populations. It would do some, but it would come at very high cost. And the other thing that I think people need to remember is that even if you tore down the Snake River dams, nobody is talking about tearing down the Hells Canyon Dam, where there's no fish passage at all. So it would only open up a portion of the river along the border between Idaho and Oregon. So there are lots of things that we can do to recover salmon, but destroying dams that produce about 7% of Washington State's energy, and going in the wrong direction in terms of energy production, and spending all of that money, literally billions of dollars, to get tiny increases in salmon recovery I think is really not the best environmental choice. There's lots of ways we can spend money to get more salmon for people who want to go fishing, and I'm all for that. Like I said, that's a big part of what I do. Tomorrow I'm going to be spending all day at a meeting about salmon recovery, so this is important to me. But we have to put our money where it makes sense, and we can't cut off our nose to spite our face.
I was thinking too, whenever I'm out for a drive just along some of the back roads and I see the pivots spraying water and realize the pivots are operating because somebody's generating power for them, and it's likely because it's that system, that hydropower system along the rivers, that really backs that up. If we didn't have that, then all of a sudden irrigation becomes an issue, and then it's nearly impossible to live in this part of the world.
And that's exactly right. And in what we did an analysis that looked at the impact on farmers, because a lot of the grain growers in eastern Oregon and Washington ship down the Snake. And that's a very inexpensive and ironically low carbon way as opposed to trucking it around. And that's a way that grain growers as far away as Iowa will use to ship down the river. So there are lots of negatives to removing the dams, which isn't to say that it doesn't have an impact on salmon. Of course it does, but I just think that there are, given all of the very high cost to tear down those dams and the risk it puts at the grid, and when you go 10 days without wind, you need every energy source. And what it shows is that if you start destroying the energy that backs up that wind, you're going to put yourself in danger. You said that 10 days is unusual, and it is. But even if it's only once every few years, how many brownouts are you willing to tolerate every few years for multiple days? I think probably not very many, in all of the businesses. It's not just the homes, it's all of the businesses that rely on that as well that lose production and things like that. So it could be a very costly mistake.
Yeah, I had a situation a few years back where I was at home doing some work on a middle of the day on a Sunday, and all of a sudden the power went out. It turned out it was a squirrel got into a transformer nearby, and we were out for about 38 minutes, but you suddenly realize I can't run the vacuum cleaner. I can't watch the television. And I hate to say it, but we are so adjusted to this type of lifestyle. People won't wait 30 seconds any longer for a traffic light, for crying out loud. Losing power for 10 days would likely, I don't want to say, I used the word anarchy earlier. I think you might see something like that going on in the streets.
Yeah, and even if we didn't have brownouts, even if we did, I was in Texas this summer when they reached the capacity, because of the hot temperatures, I was there and it was 105, they reached their capacity and they started telling companies to shut down their operations. So this is not theoretical, right? We're seeing what's happening in California. And even if you don't go 10 days, what you would see is costs spike up. So in addition to our webpage, which is washingtonpolicy.org, the other webpage people should check out is Cyber Squirrel One. And Cyber Squirrel One lists all of the squirrel attacks on our electrical grid across the country. So you mentioned that a squirrel took out the transformer. it's one of the biggest threats to our electrical grid are squirrels getting into transformers. It's a great webpage, Cyber Squirrel One.
We've got about a minute to go. Again, if people want to check out your work, can you give them the web address again?
Sure. It's washingtonpolicy.org. And like I said, I'm on Twitter at WA Policy Green, and I write about not just energy, but environmental issues, salmon as well, which obviously is an interest, and then other issues of the day on the environmental policy.
Got to tell you a quick story. Before I came here, I was hosting a talk show in Delaware, and of course, knew the people who ran your counterpart there as well, a fellow by the name of Barrett Kidner. I used to be in his office quite a bit, but I had a friend who was an oil engineer, and the University of Delaware had put up a turbine, and they put it up along a beach in southern Delaware. And one day my friend discovered that because even there it's a very windy place, but even there the wind doesn't always blow. And what they had decided to do is put an electric motor in there so they could turn it on days it wasn't windy, so the public would get the impression it was actually generating power.
Yep, that's not the only example of that story, and you often see that the wind turbines, like I said, they even when they do blow around here, they often blow in the middle of the night, which is when we need it least. So it's, there are a lot of people who are very bothered by the look of the wind turbines on the landscape. I understand that. I'm less bothered by them, but the perception is that they provide reliable, clean energy. And they do provide some energy, but it is not reliable, and it has to be backed up by other things. And the fact that we went 10 days without virtually any wind across the Pacific Northwest indicates that if you are relying on intermittent renewables like wind and solar, you're really putting yourself in danger.
Well, Todd Myers, I want to thank you very much for your time today. Good speaking with you. We hope to do it again sometime.
Absolutely. I would love to.
Take care, sir. Todd Myers joining us this morning from the Washington Policy Center on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. We're at 34. We've got a break. Also wanted to point out, coming up just after the news at 9 o'clock this morning, we've got some model railroaders joining us. Their big Christmas show coming up at the Twin Falls County Fairgrounds.